And it comes from the book of Luke in chapter 2. And this is what it says. It says, "In those days, Caesar Augustus issued a decree that a census should be taken of the entire Roman world." You know, they did that because of the taxes. It was all about the money. You know, what they wanted to do was know how many people were out there so they, could guesstimate, what kind of tax income they could get. This was the first census that took place while Quirinius was governor of Syria. And everyone went to their own town to register. So Joseph also went up from the town of Nazareth in Galilee to Judea, to Bethlehem, to the town of David, because he belonged to the house and the lineage of David. He went there to register with Mary, who was pledged to be married to him and was expecting a child. While they were there, the time came for the baby to be born, and she gave birth to her firstborn, a son. And she wrapped him in cloths and placed him in a manger because there was no room at the inn for them. That's the way some of the versions of Scripture tell us a little bit about this story. You know, we can read Scripture today. We're fortunate in that we can read it in various different variations. There's a contemporary English version that kind of lays it out in modern 21st century language, or you can read, the scriptures and the many of the other different types of versions that are out there. All of them kind of present the stories and the imagery in different ways. In this particular story, it talks about there was no room for them. The original Greek word meant that for an inn or whatever you want to call it, the original Greek word was one that meant that it was a public place that they were looking for. It was a place that you could stretch out and rest. The original Greek word meant that it could have been a house where somebody was simply renting a room if they had more than one room in their house. Or it could be where they were renting out a corner in their house. You could come in as a guest, pay your fee, and then you could, you and your family or whoever you're traveling with, you could sit in the corner of the room and enjoy the warmth of a fire or whatever. But this was commonplace in those days. It wasn't like today when, we think of an inn, we think of someone, a place that's been freshly prepared for us, and there's bedding there, and there's all the amenities and all that. That's not the case when Mary and Joseph were traveling. When we look at the book of Luke, Luke uses a word. The word is kataluma, and what it means is to unloose or to unharness. And this is the place that we get this understanding that Jesus was born in a stable of some sort because of this word kataluma, to unloose the animals or to unharness an animal. That's where we get this idea that Jesus was born in a stable. But in reality, Jesus, the place that they were at, it could have been the site of a governmental building. It could have been someone's home. It could have been a cave. It could have been a shelter of some sort. It could have been a stable. We really don't know because the original Greek and Hebrew words that are used kind of denote a variation of different things. Now, in those days back then, again, like I said, people would rent out a room of their house, or they would, people would be traveling and someone would knock on a door of a home and ask, do you have a place that we can spend the night? And there was usually a customary fee that was involved. And that could have been where they started off, or that could have been the type of things that they were looking for. We really don't know. I want to kind of take a different perspective of this story this morning and and kind of remind us of what it must have been like for Joseph and Mary at this point in their journey. As here they end up in Bethlehem. Here they're, Mary's getting ready to deliver the baby, and Joseph must have been frantic, really. He must have been fearful. I'm sure there was desperation, but also a lot of joy, because here is this child that they know, they've been told, is the Son of God, and Mary, of course, has been chosen to usher that child into the world. And Joseph is going different places and trying to find a place that they can do this. And they're being told, no, I'm sorry. There's no room for you here. There was somebody, probably multiple people back then, that we would look at today and say that those were the innkeepers. But they would have been people that would, maybe they were a homeowner and Joseph knocked on the door and said, hey, do you have a place for us? No, sorry, we don't. There would have been people at some of the government buildings, or maybe even temples at that time, where people could stay under some type of cover. And usually there was someone that was appointed to collect the fees and tell people where they could go and that type of thing. That would be what we would consider today to be one of the innkeepers. But regardless, there was these innkeepers, these people that were delivering bad news to Joseph and Mary left and right. I'm sorry. There's not a place here for you. I'm sorry. You got to keep moving on. The thing we need to remember here during the Advent season is that it could have been you or I. It really could have. You or I could have been the person back then that was telling Joseph, I'm sorry, but I don't have room in my home for you. I'm sorry. This particular building that you're at, where you want to come in and find shelter is full. There were thousands of people traveling back then, thousands of people traveling because of the census. They didn't have any choice. But there were people left and right telling Joseph and Mary, I'm sorry, we don't have a place for you. During Advent, how many times do you and I, and this is something we need to reflect on, I think, throughout the year, but how many times do we take the attitude of the innkeeper, and I'm sorry, God, but there's no place for you. I'm sorry, but, I know that every single day I should spend time with you in prayer, and I should meditate about, the things that are going on in my life and what your word is spoken into my heart, and just to contemplate all of those things. But, I'm too busy. I don't have time. Sometimes you and I are the ones that we tell God, no, I don't have time for this. Sometimes we say no with our resources. We do. We know that as a Christian, we believe that everything that we've been gifted with, everything that we have, ultimately belongs to God, ultimately has been provided by God. Doesn't Scripture say that all good things come from God? And yet many times we say no to the sharing of those resources when those opportunities come. Where maybe there's an opportunity to share something that God has provided so abundantly in our life with somebody that doesn't have the same things that we do or the same amount that we do. Maybe they're in dire need and we have to make that choice. Do we say yes or do we say no? There's no room here for you. Didn't Jesus tell us that whatever you do for anyone else, so you do unto me also? It's the same thing. Is there room in the inn for God in our life? Sometimes I know people shy away from living for God in particular ways because it will ultimately create too much controversy or issues with family or friends. So it's easier just not to get involved. It's easier to say to God in our heart, I'm sorry, but there's no room for this at this point in time because it doesn't fit in my plans, or it doesn't fit in my comfort zone, or it doesn't fit, with what will make everybody happy here. Sometimes we are the ones that tell God no. Realistically, there were probably multiple people that Joseph encountered that night. Probably multiple people that continually kept telling him no. Now, can you imagine the anxiety and the anxiousness that must have been building up in this guy as his wife is getting ready to deliver this child? And he has this responsibility to provide a place and all of the necessities, and he's striking out everywhere he went. It's also interesting to note that the people that were telling Joseph no, they didn't realize that they were also saying no to the ushering in of God's child, of God's son, of God's Messiah into the world back then. They didn't understand that. They didn't know that. I'm sure that if Joseph had, knocked on someone's door and says, "My wife is getting ready to deliver the Son of God," they probably would have slammed the door in his face. And those people that rejected helping Joseph and Mary back then, they didn't understand what they were doing. Many times this plan that God has in our life, we go through times, and God goes through these times of uncertainty and misunderstanding and belief, and yet he's still working through all of those things. He never stops. I can imagine that from Jesus, from his heart that night, even though he had not been born yet, even though this eternal God was waiting to be ushered into the world in human form, the words that he spoke from the cross 30-some years later must have been going through his mind. "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do." And that was so true. The people that were rejecting helping Mary and Joseph that night didn't understand what they were doing. Many times you and I, when we tell God no, we really don't fully understand what we're doing sometimes. That's not to make an excuse. It's just the reality, is sometimes we don't understand. If you think about it, this theme that Jesus spoke on the cross, "Father, forgive them, for they know not what they're doing," that theme started way back at the beginning of what God had created when he created the Garden of Eden, Adam and Eve. What did he do? When it got to the point to where they started to rebel against God, they were ushered out of the kingdom. They were ushered out of the Garden of Eden. Why? Because they didn't quite understand all that they were doing. They didn't quite understand how they got in trouble. I mean, they probably realized it at that point, when God shows up and, what, did you eat of the forbidden fruit and so forth? And I'm sure they understood at that point that they had rebelled, that they had disappointed, that they had, went against God. But I don't think they probably understood all of the consequences. So, Father, forgive them, for they know not what they do. And what God's response was, as he ushers them out of the Garden of Eden so that they didn't hurt themselves anymore. Same thing that night with Joseph and Mary. The people just didn't know. They didn't understand. Now, they had looked forward to the coming Messiah from God for hundreds of years. Hundreds of years. This had been taught and passed down from one generation to the next. It was prayed about. It was in Scripture. There was, 700 years before was talked about. One of the prophets talked about how out of, Bethlehem would come a Messiah and all of these things. But overall, the people didn't quite understand what they were saying that night. As a pastor, I can tell you all about the fun and the good things about Christmas and about Advent. The gifts and the parties and the fun times and goodwill toward men, all of those things. But if that's all that this season means to you or to I, then we have tremendously miss the point. You see, the message of Christmas is that even in the midst of our not understanding, of not knowing quite what we're doing, of not understanding the plan totally of what God is doing, how he's ushering in his salvation into the world, even in the midst of us denying it, even in the midst of us turning away from God, God was active and entered into the world regardless. You see, like the innkeeper, we're all ignorant about how God holds every detail, every aspect of our life in his hands, and that his very will keeps us breathing throughout the night. I think it was appropriate that the innkeepers, or the people that were bearing the bad news to Joseph, I think it's good that they didn't quite know the whole thing, because God does some of his best work when humankind is not interfering in the plan. He does. When you and I are at that point sometimes, when maybe we don't understand what God is doing, and maybe we even are afraid or feel like, we're negatively influencing what God is trying to do in our life. He understands all of that, and God is still forthcoming. He still is working in each one of our lives. He never stops, and he does it even when we don't understand. Even when we need to be forgiven for the things that we do, or things that we don't do, or the things that we say no to. Back then, people just, after waiting hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, they just didn't expect it. They didn't expect it. They didn't expect that all of a sudden this long-awaited Messiah was going to show up in a very unusual way, in a very unusual place. They didn't understand that the suffering would end, that the price for humankind's redemption was going to be paid. They didn't quite understand that this offer of a relationship with God was in the forefront of that world, of that society back then. The Messiah, they had the opportunity to come to him. And today is no different, even though the backdrop maybe has changed a bit, the sound of animals, if you will, in a stall maybe has given way to some of the busyness of the holiday season. You and I have a tremendous thing that we can be grateful for, and that is that even when we were ignorant of what God was doing, he was doing. He was ushering in the salvation that all of us would eventually need. All of us would eventually want. They didn't know. And I find that a beautiful thing, because even in my own life, when I didn't really pay attention, when I didn't know, when I didn't understand what God was doing, or even if God existed, he still was there. And Jesus was still saying, Father, forgive them, because he didn't understand. Father, forgive them, because they don't understand all that's going on. You see, that's the beauty of Christmas, is that even though maybe things are different today, even though we might not be able to, to revel in the Christmas parties and the excitement and all of those things, just like back then when God was working when people didn't know, today we can be assured that God is working in our life and in this world. There's no doubt about it. And we have the advantage point where we can look back and we can see hundreds and hundreds of years of history, and how God's plan was told, and how people were waiting, and how suddenly it finally happens, and we hear and we see all of this, and we can look back and see And through Scripture, we can see the end. We know the beginning, the middle, and the end. And it's all good. All we have to do, all that you and I have to do, is accept it. And you know what? It's the best thing we could ever do. It is the most exciting news that we could ever have. You know, I've told you all before that as a pastor, you get involved a lot with people that are, they're at the end of their life. You know, they're at the end of the journey. And there's nothing more devastating than to get to that point and not have accepted this offer that God has given to the world through the redemption of his, of our lives through the birth of his son Jesus and ultimately his death on the cross. But there's another joy that I've experienced where you're with someone at the end of their life and they're filled with joy. Not because they're going, nobody wants to die, but they have a complete understanding or, a great understanding of what it is that God has done for them and where they're going. It is a beautiful, beautiful picture. So this year, this Christmas, this Advent season, I hope you'll join with me, not being overwhelmed by COVID and, all of the changes in our lifestyle today. I hope that you'll spend time with me considering, and as the scripture says, pondering, that's what Mary did with all this stuff, but thinking about what God has done for us, what he continues to do for us, and the offer that he has made to each and every one of us. That's what it's all about.